Okay, we are going to record the session as usual, and I'll post the video later. So as I mentioned last lecture, this session is going to be a little special. Okay, it's supposed to be tailored to your needs to prepare you for the upcoming IE1. So I have a few examples of live coding that I would like to go through. I think they're going to be directly relevant to the upcoming IE1. But at any point, if you have questions, please feel free to jump in. You know that this is a general rule, right? But even more so than usual today. Today is where all the questions you have to help you get ready for IE1 should come out. Okay, so don't worry if it's not a very well-defined question or something like that. Just put out there whatever is bothering you so we can sort it out during the session. Okay, and depending on the needs, that can be a long session, that can be a short session. We are going to see. Okay, all right, so there are potentially 2.5 examples that I would like to take with you today. Let me start with actually the one that is the closest to the exam. I have released in Canvas, let me see if I can pop this up here. I have released in Canvas 2 files, ie12020.java, and they're already available if you want to download them, and invoiceitem.java. This is the closest I can give you from IE1 without actually giving you IE1, which would, I guess, make all of our life easier, but that's not what we're going to do. Anyway, so this is actually the last year, IE1. We covered exactly the same material, so I have exactly the same expectation, and down to the phrasing. Because a lot of you tell me always, I'm okay, and then comes the exam, the phrasing throws me off, or I didn't expect you to turn it quite this way, etc. So the deal here is to expose you to that kind of phrasing beforehand so that we really try to eliminate any source of surprise except the topic of the exam itself, which should be a surprise. Okay? So, I encourage you to check it out. I wanted to mention it first because this is kind of self-contained, which means that you can use it as one last practice exercise, before IE1 to check that everything is okay, that you're ready. And if you are not ready, don't freak out. We still have like a few days. We still have office hours. Okay. Don't hesitate. If you cannot attend any of the office hours that are regularly scheduled, don't hesitate to contact me, message me, and I'll try to work out something with you. Okay. So you can take this as an extra practice exercise. We should have time today at the end probably to get it started at least, or something like that. Again, depending on the number of questions and stuff like that. So we'll take a look at it, but if we don't even open it today, treat it as a practice exercise. Okay? That's the most important thing. The second thing that I have on my shop for today is a small example of static variable, because this is generally a topic that is kind of the hardest from module 1. Static variable, static attribute, I should say, sorry. Static attribute, non-static attribute, static method, non-static method. Okay? So if you're already all set on this, perfect. If not, I have an example here that we can work on during the session today. And I will uploaded it already on Canvas. It's called Tinkering with Static. Okay? Quite aptly named. And of course, you have time to ask questions. But I want to reassure you that IE1, if you look, by the way, at IE1 from 2020, you are going to see that we don't dig deep into static. Okay? So this is like the latest topic that we covered in M1. We are going to emphasize it more probably in IE2 or something like that. All right. And then last but not least, and this is what we are going to start with, I have an example that we can actually stretch in every possible way, very possible direction, that I'm going to use to kind of conduct a review of all the main things that you need to be aware of for IE1. Okay? This example is about making a to-do list, and we are going to implement it. We are going to, like I said, we can stretch it in whatever direction. If you tell me, for example, well, can we try to integrate some arrays in there, etc.? Yes, we can. We can integrate everything that we covered. So I rely on you to tell me, what you need. I don't want to go over stuff that, if possible, that you all know already. Okay? And since this is a review session, by the way, if you take a look at the code that I uploaded, if you start like listening here to what we do with the to-do list, etc., and you realize, you know what, I'm already ready. I should probably spend that time, pretty much reviewing some slide or some reading assignment for IE1. feel free to leave at any time. Okay, you're not going to hurt my feeling or anything. Just pack your stuff, leave. I totally understand. But if you are lost, then hang around and ask anything. Even if the question you feel, this is a question that's really backward, I feel embarrassed. I have students that come to me and say that all the time. Please don't feel embarrassed. This is going to completely hinder your learning. Okay, I'm here to help you, so there's no need to feel embarrassed about anything. Okay. All right. So we have like an empty file here, and I'm going to pop up my list of to do for that to-do list. So what we want to do, we are going to kind of so this one is not written as an exam. Okay, I'm going to start with a blank file. So if you want to see the format of the exam, you look at the IE1 2020 on Canvas. Okay, this is just like pretty much like freestyle coding. So I'm going to tell you what I expect. I'm going to implement it. If you want me to add some feature, let me know. We'll work them in to review specific topics and so on and so forth. Okay, so it's really free form. So what we are going to do together, we're going to do a class that represents a to-do item. Okay. Something that has to be done. What are we going to put in that class? Well, that's the problem of whoever is designing the class. We are going to code it. So I'm going to tell you a starter point, okay, what we should be putting in that class at the minimum level. We can still add later on. So minimum level, we are going to need a description, a title maybe. Let me double check what I have here. If I can find my mouse, that is. There we go. So at the very minimum, we are going to have a title. We are going to have a description of the to-do item, okay? So we could do with just one of them, doesn't matter. We are going to have a date created, a date completed, and a flag that tells us is the item has been done actually or not. And the logic of the class will be to keep up to date, those date created. When you create the to-do item, well, just timestamp it with the current date, okay? And that's going to give us an opportunity to just practice a little bit the date class. There are two classes that I mentioned were really important in the reading assignment, but we are not going to talk a lot about them in the slide. Date and random, okay? If there are only two classes that you need to remember, on the set of utility classes in the JDK, is those two, because we use them generally a lot, okay? So here we are going to illustrate date. The idea being that when I create the object, well, I'm going to timestamp it with the current date. And later on, if at any point I set the object to done, so I said this to-do item is completed, so I'm going to have like a method to do that. That method is going to keep track of this with an attribute, is done, we're going to call it, for example. And it's going to also record the date and time at which we completed the task. And then we're going to use that also as an example to play a little bit with a method named toString, TOString uppercase S, which we are going to use a lot for the rest of the semester. Okay, so I'm going to introduce it now. It can be useful for the IE1, of course. It can be useful for all of the IEs up to the final. Okay, you are going to see this is something really practical. It allows us to say, I have an object, and when you call the toString method on that object, you're pretty much telling the object, tell me what you contain in a human-readable format, meaning a string of text. So the object would describe itself. Like, for example, to-do item, this is my title, do the dishes, not, description, yeah, it's about time I do them, and then date completed, date created, and then is it completed or not? Yes, no, okay? So we're going to use that a lot for debugging purpose. Sometimes even when the requirement do not ask us to implement that, we just implement it ourselves just so that we have a quick way to display on the screen, what's inside the objects without having to fire up the debugger every time. So let's start with the attributes. So every time you are asked in an exam to define some attribute, I will try to be super specific about whether I want them public, private, or default visibility. Okay, these are the only three choices that we cover so far. So for this class here, we are going to go all out private. And this is going to be very often the case. Okay, the idea being that an attribute that is public, as we discussed last time, is potentially a liability. It's potentially something that somebody can access inside your object and modify without you knowing exactly how they are going to modify it in the future, okay? So we are going to start by saying, okay, I want a private string, and we're going to call this title. Okay, and then private string description. Would it be better if I did this, by the way? What do you guys think? Yeah? No, go ahead. You raise your hand.
Doesn't it still do the same thing? It's just not leading anything?
No, actually, no. That's a very good remark there. Okay, I almost fell for that. Yeah, no, it's not doing exactly the same thing. I was thinking, isn't it doing the same thing as having it in the constructor? And I was going to say kinda, but there's a subtle difference. But this is actually different from what Java does by default, which I think this is what you're thinking, right? The default value, all right. So this is what Java would do by default, okay? So quick review right now on empty string and null strings, okay? These are different animals. What you have here is you have an attribute title, so visualize a variable title in memory, right? 32-bit or something like that. It's a reference variable. Okay. That reference variable currently contains null, just a bunch of zeros, and that means I'm not referring anything. That's it. That's what happened with references. Now, if it was a numerical primitive data type, Java would put a 0 into that attribute. If it was a char, it would put the Unicode character of index 0 in the Unicode table. I mean, it has like all sorts of rules like that we had summarized on the slide, okay? But the null string is particularly interesting because the null string means no string. And the one thing that people confuse it every semester with is the empty string, because in our minds, an empty string means nothing. There's no text there. So this is an empty string. This is a null string. The null string means in that variable you have a bunch of zeros. I don't refer to anything. The empty string, what would happen here is that I would have this attribute description in memory. And inside of description, I would have an actual reference. A reference to an actual object of type string that would be in the heap, right? Quick review there. And that object of type string would be actually the string that contains no characters. But it's still a string, okay? It's like if I give you like a piece of paper that contains a message, so be it. If I give you a piece of paper and I tell you this piece of paper is blank, you still get a piece of paper, right? So you still get an object. Same thing here. So watch out for that difference, okay? But yes, Java would do, by default, assigning null to those things. So if I was putting this, all right, no. Yeah, I would not be doing anything more than what Java already does for me, okay? Now, let's say that I want to make sure that by default, those things are empty strings, okay? I can write it like that. The one piece of warning that I gave you about this notation is you are going to see it in the textbook, okay? I much prefer that instead of assigning values like that directly where you declare the attribute, you assign all of your default values in the constructors, okay? And as we dig deeper and deeper and deeper in the constructors, I will try to finally, dig and get to the root of why I'm asking you to do that. But for now, let's leave it be as a preference, okay? Both way would work right now for the simple program that we write. As we get into more complicated code, then yeah, there are going to be subtle differences, etc. We need to get there first, okay? So instead of doing this, what I've been mentioning is you should really only declare the attribute, not initialize them, and then you should have a constructor. And constructors are just method, but they are method with special rules. Yeah?
Right now, are we in the main method?
Right now, we are in the main method. I'm so sorry, I didn't pay attention to that. We are absolutely in the main method. So I'm going to create a new Java file. Thank you for catching that. Public class, and we're going to call it to do item, okay? And now I can put my attributes there, okay? To go back to the I didn't plan on showing you that, but since I did this mistake, let's try to get something out of it. If I was here and I put this here, that would be local variables, and local variable cannot be private. So pretty much a compiler would tear me a new one every time I try to compile this, okay? I could try to get this to work by putting it here. If I put it here, then I do have attributes. But I have attributes in the wrong class, okay? I had just a standby class called M1 Review Live AM, right? and I put my attribute there, but really what I want is to model a to-do item. So why don't I do it in the proper class, the to-do item class, okay? So, all right, now that we have this out of the way, let's go back to the actual class that we're going to write. So I'm going to save it so that it renames it for me, to-do item, there we go. And make sure it compiles. I should have done that before. That would have told me right away that I was doing something wrong. So we have two attributes. Before I go any further, I'm going to try to play a little bit with the constructor and initialize those attributes, okay? So what are the rules for constructors? It's kind of a method, but what's special about it? You guys remember? Yeah? It has no return value, not even void. Yeah.
It has to be the same name as the class.
All right, so let me take this and run away with it. Public, and a constructor technically doesn't have to be public, okay? I don't remember if it was during this session in the morning or during the afternoon, but one student asked me, can we have a constructor that's private? And the answer is, yes, you can. But the full story is at the end of the class, during office hours, or if you ever take an elective in Java, okay? Because right now it would seem stupid to have a private constructor, okay? Because that means I have a constructor, but nobody can use it. So that means I can never create objects of that class. That's exactly the point. You can lock down a class to the point where you will not be able to create objects of that class in the traditional way. But we have other ways to create objects, okay? So here, public, so I'm not going to deal with that in COP2513. We always have public constructors. And I'm going to say same name as a class, like you guys said. And no return data type, not even void here. So I just skip from public to do item directly. And then if I want parameters, I'm going to put them there. And then the goal of my constructor is always to initialize the object. So initialize the object means go through all of the attributes. And for example, here we have title. I want to set the title to an empty string. We have description. I want to set it to an empty string. Okay? So that's the proper way to initialize down to, the preference that I'm kind of trying to push you toward. This is a no-arg constructor, quick remark. So it takes no argument, which means whoever is trying to construct an object right now is not telling me anything. So I have to make up default value by myself, okay? We can have multiple constructors, and these are going to accept argument that allow me to know what the user of my class wants me to put instead in the title and description, for example. Last thing before we move to that other constructor. Well, first let's make sure that this compiles. There we go. The string creation. The first thing we are going to do in module 2 is go back and talk a little bit more about string. Okay, to explain to you exactly what happened when you use this very convenient notation, like string something equal double quote, and you put the text that you want in that string. Well, it creates an object, right? It creates an object of class string and puts some text inside of it. So pretty much what it does is this. Okay? So I just want to introduce the notation, just in case you stumble across it, while studying, textbook, websites, whatever, right? These two notations are almost equivalent. The only difference, we're going to talk about it in module 2, it's a very subtle difference again. One of those things, that when things don't go right, then you have to know about it to be able to track down the bug. But for IE1, whether you write, title equal double quote, or title equal new string object, parentheses, I want it to contain double quote, same thing. Okay? So you can exchange the two notation as much as you want for the next IE. All right, so we have a constructor. Let's do another one. We're on fire. Constructors are our thing. So there we go, to do item. And this time, I'm going to put some parameters here. So generally, it's not a hard rule, okay? But generally, since the job of the constructor is to initialize, at least to initialize all of the attributes, okay? When it starts accepting parameters, that means it's going to start accepting parameters that help it initialize the attribute. So sometime, not every time, but you are going to have like one parameter per attribute or something like that. This is a very common occurrence, okay? But it fits pretty much the job of the descriptor, of the constructor, sorry. So I'm going to say string title, string description, And then I'm going to say my title is the title that you gave me. My description is the description that you gave me. Okay? And we're going to try to compile this. Do you guys think it's going to compile? No? Okay. You're on the right track. I don't say we'd say no, but you were on the right track. There is a problem. It's just that the compiler is going to let it slip by. That's another problem on top of the first problem, okay? So, what's happening here? Well, let's leave it like that, okay? And then we're going to go back, because my point is to review the des notation here. But let's leave it at that right now. And let's jump into our main method. So we're going to have another file where we have a main method. And we're going to use it to test our code. Because right now, the code for to-do item, there we go, it compiles, right? So the compiler is telling me, sure, this is good Java, keep going. But if I never test it, I never know if it's working. It's good Java, but it could be good Java that does something completely different. So let's test this thing. So to-do item, I'm going to call it T1, new to-do item. And I'm going to use the noarg constructor first. Quick side note, when you look at invoice item.java and IE2020.java, the files that are from last year's, right? Last year IE1, you are going to notice that in the main, there's just a block of command that say you're going to get 3 points for writing test. So this time, you guys are going to be in the driver's seat for writing the test. And it's going to be the same thing for the upcoming IE1, okay? But I'm going to show you what kind of test I expect you to write. It doesn't have to do with, those loop and those matrices. You don't have to do anything that complicated. But what I want to see, and what the grader will want to see, is that when you write your main, you trigger pretty much all the features that you claim your code implement, right? That's the point. My code is supposed to give me a constructor. I'm going to do something in the main that allows me to call that constructor, and if there are many different options in the ways to call it, I'm going to use all those options and try to visualize. So we're not going to automate the test yet, but just display stuff on the screen that allows you or your grader to visually inspect, that your code is doing what it's supposed to do. And every semester, I have like 1 or 2 students that actually write code in the test that says, test passed or something like that, or sometimes they even go in the code for the test and modify it and say the test passed, etc. Don't waste your time doing that, because we look at the test, but we also look at the code. Okay, so even if you display on the screen, everything is fine, everything is shiny, there's nothing to see here, the grader is still going to look into that and make sure that it's actually working and potentially run their own series of tests on your code. Okay? All right. So, to-do item T1 equal new to-do item. Well, that's nice. How do I test that this is working and doing what I think it is doing? Well, I should do something like system.out.println and println, for example, the value of T1.title. And then I should maybe do T1.description. So same question about this one. Do you see a reason for which this would not compile? Spoiler alert, it's not going to compile very well. So something as private access. Remember, I'm playing my attribute private. The goal is exactly that. This is what visibility modifier do. Okay? I didn't have time to live illustrate it, during the lecture, but now we're taking the time. You have said that in the class to-do item, the attributes are private. Now I am in another class. I'm trying to use the code from to-do item. If I try to use a dot notation to access those attributes inside the object, it's going to tell me, no, you can't. Okay? Private stuff. You're not supposed to be able to touch this because you are a piece of code that is outside the class. Okay? Inside the class here, I didn't have any problem, accessing title and description because I was inside the class where title and description live. All right. Here, that's not going to work. So what I'm going to try to do instead is I'm going to try to tell Java, well, okay, fine, just display the entire object for me. There we go. And that actually compiles. So that's always good news. Now let's check what it does. This is where the bad news can come in, okay? I'm going to run this code. It creates the object. First, good news, it doesn't crash. It's always good news, right? It doesn't crash, no exception, etc. So, okay, I didn't do anything that is that obviously wrong. But it displays on the screen, to-do item at, and then some hexadecimal sequence of numbers, okay? That's actually how a reference will look when you try to display. And that's what I displayed here. I displayed T1. T1 is a reference variable that contains a reference to an object of class to-do item. So this is Java's default way of displaying an object. It just tells me this is a reference 15db9742 that is a reference for an object of class to-do item. And that's it. Not very useful. So I can do better than that. And this is when I'm going to introduce the toString method. So I'm going to add another method here, public, so that I can use it. The name of the method is toString, in the sense of convert to a string, right? So toString method takes no parameters. It returns something of data type string. So I call toString on an object. It returns to me a string object, a new string object that describes what's inside the object. So I'm going to return something, a string, okay, and I'm going to start with that. If I do this, I compile my to-do item.java, it compiles. I go back to the main, I compile the main, I run the main. So whenever there is a toString method in your classes, okay, when you try to display something like a reference to an object of that class with Java, automatically it calls toString. So it's just like if I wrote this, and I can write this actually explicitly if I want, run it. There we go, it works. Okay, but the trick is, even if I don't write toString, .toString, if Java finds itself trying to display a reference of an object of class to-do item, it checks out the class to-do item and checks if there is a toString method. And if there is a toString method, cool, I have a way to convert that object into a string of text, so I may display it. And system.out.println is smart enough to do that. So it calls automatically toString, get a string, display it on the screen. So obviously, instead of just displaying something stupid like this, I might want to actually display something useful. For example, this is a to-do item, right? So I'm going to display the title of the to-do item, and then maybe follow that between parentheses with the description. So something like this. Display the title, plus, space, open parentheses, and I'm going to close the parentheses eventually. There we go. And in the middle here, I'm going to put the description. There we go. So this compiles. Go back here, compile again the main, run it, and now it tells me nothing. My title is blank, my description is blank. Let's go back here to this. Well, yeah, that makes sense. So if I wanted to create a default object that has an empty string for title and empty string for description, I just did that, and I have a way here to validate, verify that this is happening. So what I would expect here is when you do stuff like that, you should self-comment your stuff so that when you run the test, it makes sense. For example, here, creating and displaying a default to-do item. So when I write this, I know I expect, empty string, empty description, empty title. Perfect. And now I'm going to do another test. So that would be my first test. My second test, creating and displaying, I'm going to call it a specified, but it's not a specific vocabulary, right? It's not a technical term. A specified to-do item, what I mean by that is I'm going to give it a name, I'm going to give it a title and a description, pretty much, okay? So I call the constructor and I say the title is do something, the description, anything, really. And that's it. And I'm going to call that T2, and I'm going to display T2, and nothing can go wrong with that. Compile, it compiles. I could recompile, just to be super paranoid, I could recompile to-do item, even though I didn't modify it. Recompile the main, just to be safe, and then run it. That's where it gets interesting. So my first test, I'm okay with it. It worked. Did I just clear this like an idiot? Okay, yes, I did. There we go. All right, so the first test, it displays nothing. That's what a default to-do item is. No title, no description. Awesome. The second test, I specified a title, I specified a description. They are lost in translation. This bug happens to many students. I don't know, maybe just to put a number on it, let's say a fourth of the student every semester at some point. Either because you didn't understand what I'm going to explain right now, or because you understand it, but you forgot, you typed something you didn't realize, like we all do, and now you have this bug. And this bug means nothing, right? Yeah.
Can you scroll down a bit?
Yes, absolutely. Like in the main right here?
Yeah.
Yeah. There we go. Yeah, don't hesitate to let me know when you want me to scroll, okay? So this is a nasty bit of bug. Why? Because everything compiles, everything runs and doesn't crash. You might not, have a good intuition for that right now yet because you haven't encountered it enough yet. But it's better for something to break immediately. Like you press a button, the thing collapses, there's something wrong with that button. Okay? But you turn on a machinery, it works for 6 months, and then you get a call at 3 a.m. from your boss saying, the big machinery, blah, 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 that our business relies on, etc., is down. You come, you look at the machinery, you have no clue what went wrong and when. It's the same thing with coding, right? It's better if I type a line of code and immediately compilation error, crash, or whatever. Here, I was able to write, and I kind of sneaked that on purpose in, I was able to write multiple things since I introduced that bug. And those things are working. For example, I was able to write the code for the test here. I was able to write the the toString method here, okay? And all that stuff actually is correct. I'm cheating because you would not know if it's correct if you were facing the error, okay? But I'm telling you, all that stuff is correct. The problem goes back here. What is the problem here? Yeah? I'm missing this, okay? So, I wanted to just show you how insidious it is when you omit that keyword this and it was actually needed, okay? Most of the time, like for example here, I could put this, all right, this.title, this.description, and if I do, it's still compile, and take my word for it, it's still going to run the same way, okay? I'm not changing anything, I'm just being pedantic, I'm just being over-specific. So, most of the time, the des keyword is optional. There is one time where the des keyword, the des followed by a dot, actually, to be very specific, where that syntax is mandatory. It's when we have ambiguity in the names. So how can I fix this? No pun intended. I can change the name of the parameter. Now I called it parameter title and parameter description. So if I go here and I say parameter title, parameter description, okay, now I have a different name here and here. This is going to work a lot better. Let me compile it, compile the main, run it. There we go. So it's working. So what exactly is happening here? What's happening here when I do have the same name is that I don't assign anything to the attribute. This attribute over here, there we go, and this one, they are not assigned anything by that constructor. What's happening is that instead, I use the word title. What is the closest definition of title? This is this one here, and there we go. The parameter is assigned its own value. So as long as it's an empty string, nobody notices. If it's actually a text that means something, then I assign to the parameter the same text that says, for example, the title of the task is do something, and then I didn't touch the attribute, so that didn't get modified. I reach the end of the method, the local variable disappears, the parameter disappears. I'm left with untouched attributes. So untouched attribute means it still has its default value, which is empty string. Okay? Sorry, not empty string, null string. Okay? That's why we saw null being displayed here. So why does it have a null string as default value? Well, because the attributes here are declared but not initialized. So you know that Java is going to put a null by default here. And then the one piece of code that was supposed to initialize them, the constructor, failed miserably, so it didn't change that default value. Okay? That's it. That's a complete scenario. If you wrap your head around all of this, that's it. You're ready for IE1 for that topic. Okay? I have nothing more sneaky that I can throw at you to try to confuse you or trick you, etc. This is the whole story. If you understand it, then no matter what happens in your code, you're going to be able to figure it out with respect to, this kind of bug. That's it. All right. Sounds good? You guys are comfortable with this? Yeah.
Mine still displays like the hexadecimal notation.
Oh, make sure, this is where the problem comes from. Make sure that this is spelled, T lowercase, S uppercase. Make sure it returns a string data type, and make sure that it is declared public as well. Was that the problem? Yeah.
You mentioned this. Can you show us how you would correct that?
Yes, absolutely. I was going to remove this P description first. Actually, you know what? Let me illustrate both solution. Okay. I renamed one of the parameter, and I'm going to use this to fix the bug with the other parameter, with the other attribute and parameter. Okay. So why does this work? Why does it work? It works because now when I see title here, when I, meaning Java, when Java sees title here, it looks up and it says, okay, you define title here, so you're talking about the parameter. That's the closest definition from where you're using the name of the variable. And then when you define here title, I would go and assume it's the parameter as well, except that you said des.title. So that means whatever object I'm currently applied to, whatever object I'm constructing, inside that object there should be an attribute named title. And that's enough to actually make it so that, hold on, let me close this, I have pop-ups right and left here. And that's enough so that it's going to make it actually access that attribute. So the point today is definitely not for me to rush you through anything, okay? So I want to go through what I think is going to be a problem for some, what I've seen be a problem for previous students, previous years, etc. But before we move on forward, are you guys comfortable with this?
Could you go over again why in the two-string method when you put this dot title, this dot description, it still wouldn't work when?
Let me show you when it would not work, because maybe that's going to actually, trigger that Eureka stuff here. What if I had a local variable string title equals root? Okay? So I'm going to revert back to not using this because, like I said, you don't have to use it here. It's perfectly fine not to use it. And I showed you that it was working when we were not using it. But now I introduce that little local variable here. So I'm going to recompile. And I'm going to run. Where is that coming from? Every time I call toString, it's like toString is confused. toString, when I say title, instead of thinking, oh, title, you mean that attribute, right? No, it's thinking title. Let me check the code. You are here. There we go. You are here. You refer to the variable title. Where can I find out about this variable title? And Java starts looking inside the scope of the current method. So is there any local variable here named title? Bingo. You must be talking about that. And that's it. It kind of, how to say, it shadows the attribute. The attribute is still there, but we never kind of reach it. We look for the first easy grab, in terms of where is my variable, and there's one right here. I'm going to grab it and use it. And this is exactly the same thing that happens when you have parameters. String, title, like this, okay? It's stupid because toString never takes a parameter, but just for the sake of argumentation, right? If I had a parameter in this method, same thing, the parameter would stand between me and the attribute. So to fully answer your question, what happens is whenever you use a variable name inside a method, Java first checks, is this a local variable inside this method? Yes, no. If yes, I take it. If no, then is this a parameter for this method? Yes, I take it. No? Oh, well, is this an attribute for this class? So you look at the method body, the parameter of the method where you are in, and then the class attribute. It's like 3-step visibility process, right? So that's exactly how Java figures out which variable you're talking about. So anything that stands in the way, like a parameter here, for example, even if I remove this guy, well, the parameter is still standing in the way of my attribute. So only when there is no local variable with a name title and no parameter with a name title in the current method, then only then I'm going to see the attribute. Yeah?
So how come in the main method of the other class, when you do system.out.println T1,
Yeah?
you don't have to call the method toString?
Oh, that's not a big deal, okay? But it's confusing, yes. It's because Java does it automatically. A lot of the confusion when you learn a programming language is to figure out everything that the programming language tries to do to help you. Because once you get used to it, yes, it helps you, it saves you time, I don't have to type toString. But at the beginning, you're like, okay, what's happening here? Is it magic? Is it like, so yeah, this is exactly what it is right now. It's just Java does this for us. Dot toString, okay? It does this in the context of every time you have a reference variable and you're trying to println it, okay? Or even if you try to concatenate a reference variable to a string, every time the context says, you know, I have a reference variable, but I would like a text representation of that object, then Java automatically calls toString. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. We are going to, well, actually, I didn't plan for that, but we can add, I don't know, what we really had for this. What about priority? Priority sounds good. So you meant as an attribute, right? Okay. So first, let me make sure that I have a version, because I've made so many modifications right and left. I want to make sure I have a version that works. So empty, do something, anything really. Okay, so we are in good ground. So now let's add, for example, private int priority. Okay? So same thing, I declare it here as an attribute, don't initialize it, and then in the constructor, what I can do is I can say priority equal, well, we're going to say the default priority is 0, right? I'll get to it when I get to it. But then, again, what we could do is we could say, if you give me the title and the description, then the priority will be 0 as well. But then I could have a third constructor. Okay. And that constructor would take a title, would take a description, and would take a priority. Okay. And I use the name of the parameter are the same name as the attribute, so I have to watch out. Okay. Des.title equal title. Des.description equals description, and I need to use a des.notation. Okay, again, if it doesn't makes fully sense, like stop me. Okay, say something. Priority.
Have you seen a lot of that, like in like the real world, like the names of the parameters being the same as the names?
There are advantages. There are advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage is that I have to be verbose. I have to write des.des.des. In my constructor. But the advantage is that when I look at your constructor, just looking at the first line, I know what you're asking me, and I know where it's going. If you tell me, title, description, priority, and I know your class, I've read the description of your class, I know that you have a title, a description, a priority. This constructor, I don't even read the code. I look at the first line and I say, okay, you're going to get some information from me, put it in the attribute, and you cover 3 of the attribute. When I look at this one, I'm looking at it and say, oh, you cover only 2 of the attribute, the title and the description. So you are going to have to make up something for the priority, and that's indeed what you do. So after a while, you get used to that, and that allows you to just look at the first line of the constructor and to pretty much anticipate 90% of what's going to actually be done inside of it. Okay? It's kind of like we develop conventions with one another, and we rely on those to kind of take shortcuts. So it's getting, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
If you did, in like the first 2 constructors, if we didn't like initialize priority, it would still be 0 because the default value is 0.
Yes, that's correct. If I remove this, okay, by default, Java, remember, when you have a an attribute like this, it's going to put a default value in it, just to be nice, to be useful. For numerical primitive data type, it's going to be a form of 0. Either 0 for int long or 0.0 for float and char, okay? And that's it. So we don't even have technically to do that. What I recommend is, and again, this is not something that you have to do, but what I recommend to avoid error is if you have 3 attributes and you need to initialize them all in the constructor. So that if you want to change that at any point, if you say, for example, the default priority, well, I'm not happy with 0. I'm going to start counting at 1. So there we go. Priority is equal to 1 by default. And then you can specify it if you want, if you prefer. And then what? If you don't specify it and you don't somehow initialize your object, it's going to be 0. But now I know that if I see a 0 inside priority, there's a problem. Somehow my constructors were bypassed, somebody created an object, that object ended up with priority 0. I have no clue how they did that. I need to make sure that, I pretty much, I stopped that potential breach. Okay, somebody found a way around my code, I need to stop that, put a cork in it, and make sure that this cannot happen ever again. So here, compiles. I don't know yet how it's working, okay. If I want to see it actually do something on the screen, I should probably add here something that say priority equals and then plus priority, okay. So I'm adding that to the toString so that now when we display an object, it's going to also display its priority. And I'm going here and I'm going to first check that my first 2 objects work. So that's called regression testing. I added a feature, the priority, but I'm making sure first that I didn't break, anything from before. So both objects had a priority of 1. And now I'm going to add one more test. And you see how I'm making the test really easy, right? And this is what I expect you to do for IE1. I say easy in the sense that I display what I'm trying to figure out. For example, creating and displaying a specified to-do item. Okay. There we go, a to-do item with specified priority, okay? And I'm going to say here, for example, priority 99. This is very important. There we go, all right? Compile this, and it's still T2, so T2 is not going to work because I'm using it already. So I'm going to put T3. All right, so let's break this down. We should make it like a little nicer on the display. But the first one has no title, no description, priority of 1. The second object has do something, anything really, priority of 1. And then the third, seriously, do something, anything really, priority 99. Okay? So that allows me to double check as I write the code that everything is kind of making sense. And you can add as many or as few tests as you want. What we are looking for is a minimum, okay? We want to see a minimum amount of tests. So the way it's phrased, you're going to see it in IE1 2020.java. The way it's phrased is you should call your method, all the method, including constructor, and call them on any possible case they are supposed to handle, and even the case that are edge case that are not supposed to really be able to handle, okay? So you're trying to really illustrate here that you completed all the requirement. And you can do it very tersely. You can do it with a lot of tests. Yeah.
You get priority 99.
How do I get priority 99? So when I call the constructor here, so my third test, right? To do item, I pass 1, 2, and 3. There we go. So that's going to trigger the third constructor, the one that takes priority. It's going to assign that specific priority. When you look at the old IE1, you're going to also see something about, how did I phrase that? You're going to see something about chaining constructors. So chaining constructor is also another important thing that we discussed. And we discussed it towards the end, so I'm going to refresh your memories a little bit on it right now. Chaining constructors means when I look at my code here, there's a lot of redundancy. There's a lot of, okay, look, we assign 3 times, title, description, priority. We assign title, description, priority. We assign title, description, priority. So this is kind of getting old. It's not just getting old, yawning or something like that. It's getting old in the sense that I need to maintain consistency across all of the constructors. If I add a new, like we added priority, if I add something new, like whatever, like date completed or something like that, now I need to handle it in every one of the constructors. I am going to end up forgetting. One day I will update, the way that I handle priority, change it from 1 to, for example, instead of going, priority 1 is the lowest, I want to say priority 100 is the lowest. So I go in there and I say, okay, I'm going to modify it. There we go. This is my priority. And for whatever reason, I didn't see here that I had a priority of 1 as well. And there we go. I have an interesting bug in my code. Sometimes my object has a high priority. Sometimes it has a low priority. It depends on which constructor. That should not happen. Okay. So to try to avoid this kind of stuff, that's why I keep saying redundancy in code is pure evil. So to try to avoid this kind of stuff, we can say that the constructor that takes 3 arguments here, right now, this is what we could call a fully qualified constructor. And again, this is not a common terminology. This is just a terminology that I use. What do I mean by fully qualified or fully specified, constructor? That means that when somebody uses that constructor, they tell me everything about the object. The title, the description, the priority. So they fully specify what they want. Okay? So that one is kind of a universal constructor. Because when I look at this guy here, that has only, and I'm going to go back to priority 1 being the lowest. When I look at this guy here that pretty much doesn't get anything from whoever calls it and has to make up values on its own, this guy should be able to just call the constructor from the class that takes 3 parameters and give it the 3 values as follows. That's the second syntax of the des keyword, okay? And if you want to get full credit when you implement constructors, you have to think about this. You have to, like the first version, I don't care, get it to work, right? Get it to work like we did together here. You're going to get 80-90% of the points on that question. This is like a good way to move forward. But then, if you have like 15 minutes at the end of the exam or something like that, go back to this and say, you know what, I know that I repeated, cut and pasted my code over and over and over and over. I remember this thing about constructor chaining. Let me just try to implement it real quick. And this should not change anything in our code, okay? Or like if I compile it, of course it should compile, hopefully. So that's always minimum. But if I recompile the main and run it, okay, I didn't add or remove any feature. I just rewrote the code so that it's just a little cleaner, a little easier to maintain and stuff like that. This is what we call refactoring, okay? And I just double check that I didn't break anything by taking a quick look at my test. And my tests are still doing everything that they were supposed to do. So we're good. Going back here. So now that I have simplified this, I can simplify maybe the middle one too. Because the middle one, you give me a title and a description, and I have to make up a priority. Well, I can do that. So this. So the des followed by a parenthesis means you are calling an other constructor from the same class. Okay? You're not calling a constructor from another class. The des line, like one of you mentioned last time, the des call here needs to be the first thing you do in a constructor. If you are going to call another constructor, do it on the first line of that constructor. So that constructor, first thing it does is call another constructor, and then if I needed to do something more, for example, system.app.println, because I'm debugging, you just called the noarg constructor. I could still do more stuff after, okay, but the first step has to be the call to another constructor if you want to call another constructor. Same thing here, okay, and then what do we have at the bottom? And then at the bottom we have the fully specified constructor, which is going to be the only one actually where I do the work. The other ones are just like delegating. And you're going to see that delegating work is kind of like a pillar in object-oriented programming, right? We're going to use that more and more and more as the modules come. Here, 2 out of 3 of our constructors say, you know what, ask that other guy to initialize with those values, and then maybe if there's something more to do, I'll do it. But in most cases, there's nothing more to do. So here the println is just for debugging purpose. I don't really need it. So there we go. Those two constructors, they're super easy. They're super easy, super simple. Yeah.
So why don't you use it in the fully constructed one?
Like the same trick?
Yeah.
It's because I run out of employees. What I mean by that is that I ask one of my employees, hey, can you build me an object? The employee says, sure thing. Turns around, say to the guy behind him, can you build this object? This guy says, sure thing. Asks the guy at the bottom of the food chain, can you build this thing for me? And this guy, somebody has to do the job. Okay, if I was trying to call here like another constructor, okay, for example, I could call the no-arg constructor. But what would happen? First person delegates. Now the last one delegates back to the first one. The first one sees the job coming, says, no problem, I can delegate this. Delegate to the second one, delegate to the third one. The third one always delegate back to the first one. It's going to make an infinite loop like that. Okay? So at some point, and it's a rule that we are going to talk about in next module in more detail, right? But at some point, when you start doing that chaining of constructor, that delegation of the work, right, you need at least one of the constructor to do the job, to initialize those attribute and end of story, okay? The same thing would happen, by the way, if I was trying to pass here, title, description. So I'm using the over constructor. Same thing. It's an infinite chain. Yeah?
Instead of this, could you put, like in that first constructor, the default one, could you put to do instead of this?
No, you can't.
Use the actual constructor there.
That's a good idea, but you can't. So I cannot, say, well, like two levels to answer your question, okay? First, if I did to-do item, okay, like this instead of this, well, that, how to say, philosophically, if you want to call it like that, it's the same intent. You delegate to the no-arg constructor. So the same endless cycle would go, okay? But the second level to that answer is Java won't even let you do that, because when you are inside a class and you want to call a constructor from that class, you have to use the des keyword with parentheses after it. That's the only way you have to say, I want to call another constructor from this class that I'm in right now. Okay? Okay, good question, guys. All right. Anything else? Absolutely. The toString? Cool. So I just added the priority at the end, okay? And I can make it as fancy as I want. Bottom line is it has to be readable. Yeah.
The example we have to do two different files.
Yes, as far as I remember. I would have to double check, but yes. Generally, I try to split things into separate files. So you'll probably have an IE1, .java, and then something else .java that is pretty much the main class, okay? So we're going to use that technique a lot. Yeah.
So do you recommend, like with any class that we make, whether it's like an ID or anything, to just throw in the toString method?
Yes.
Especially for this class?
Yeah, definitely. Because like you've seen, I didn't fire up the debugger yet, okay? And I could fire up the debugger. I really recommend that you use the debugger. It's a great tool when you're learning and when you're hunting down, for bugs. But with toString and with the test that I'm writing, I do something on an object, I display it. I do something on an object, I display it. So I'm constructing, a list of tests pretty much that I have to visually inspect every time. But if I go through the story that they tell me and everything is consistent, then I'm good. Yeah.
I know you said that we're going to be doing this on the exam, but would it be somewhat close to the exam?
Yeah, the point is I'm trying to give you the structures, okay? And I'm trying to draw attention to the things that have been like problems semester after semester. So while it's not the same theme, topic, it's the same problem that the exam will be, we're still talking about the essentials, which are constructors, toString method, and stuff like that, and that you can expect to see at the exam. Yeah.
With the disk, can you call static variables or private variables? Are there any out that you can't call?
Yes. So with the des keyword, so that would be the des followed by a dot, okay? Because the des followed by a parenthesis is always found inside a constructor, and it's a way to call another constructor, okay? It's very limited. But the des dot, you can find it in the code of any method in the class, okay? And yes, you could have des dot and the name of a private attribute, or des dot, and the name of a private method from that class that you are trying to call. Absolutely no problem at all. The rule is, and it's something that comes up every semester, right? The problem with visibility modifier is that the first thing that people remember is, okay, private is locked down, public is everything goes, and default we're not going to use it a lot this semester, but it's kind of in between. All right, that's the first thing that kind of stays in your brain, right? But then sooner or later you find yourself writing code, and you're like, so can I use that method or that attribute here? And it all depends on where here is. Okay, like for example here, to-do-item.java, I'm in the class to-do-item. From anywhere, any method in that class, if I want to access the private title, I can. I don't even need the keyword des, okay? But I can just say title equals something, or des.title equals something if I want, to use the des notation, right? So it separates. The notion of private means you can access it when you are writing the code of that class. As soon as you are outside that class, you are in another piece of code, another method somewhere else, another class, then you're like outside. So everything that's private is now private. You cannot access it, okay? And this is not what the des keyword helps you with. The des keyword followed by a dot, just to make sure everybody's on the same page, is going to help you only when you have multiple variables that have the same, when you have at least one variable that has the same name as an attribute. Okay? So a parameter has the same name as an attribute, red flag. Maybe I need to use des dot, the name of the attribute. A local variable has the same name as an attribute, again, red flag. Okay? All right. What else can we throw here? So, we talked about the date. We're going to do that real quick. Private date and date created or started. So when I create a to-do item, right, I'm going to say I need to record the current time and date. Okay, I'm going to do that with an object of the class date that comes with a JDK. So import java.util.date. Okay, let's make sure that the import is correct. There we go. And now I can use inside my constructors, I can say, for example, well, and I have only to modify that one constructor, by the way, because it's the only constructor that everybody else calls. So every other constructor end up executing that one. So here I can say date, what did I say, created or started? Thank you. So date started equal new date. And if I just create an object of class date, the moment I create it, it's recording pretty much the time, the current time and date. Okay? So it's going to act as a timestamp. Yeah? Sorry, say that again? I didn't add a parameter, you're correct. Why is that going to still work? So no matter which one they call, they end up there. Yeah. So nobody is going to be able to give me a date because I didn't put it as a parameter, right? And what I do instead is inside the constructor, I initialize the attribute date started with a value of my choice. Okay? So by default, Java put a null in there because there we go, this is a reference, right, attribute. So Java put a null in there. I don't want that. What I want is whenever you create a new to-do item, I want you to create an object of class date that's going to represent the current time and date and put the reference in there. So if you do that, you don't need it as parameter, right? Actually, I don't want people to tell me, hey, I'm going to create a to-do item right now and I'm going to, date it from last year or date it from like in 2 years from here. No. You create a to-do item right now, I'm going to timestamp it for you. So you don't have to always initialize based on the parameters. Sometimes you have to make up the values on your own. Like, for example, priority is like that too, right? No, priority, you can tell me the priority. So yeah, priority, I opened it up as a parameter. But here, for example, I decide the priority by default is going to be 1, right? Well, here, in a manner of speaking, I decide that the date by default is going to be the current date. Make sense? All right. Yeah.
For the priority, can you have it as a string instead of a...
Yeah. You could change a priority from an int, to a string, like for example, low, high, etc. There are a few different ways we could organize that. Yeah, absolutely. I think the idea here, the idea for which, the reason for which I picked up priority is because you were asking for like an int or something like that, right? So this is the first idea that came to mind for an int, a priority for a to-do item. All right, so now we have a priority, we have a date, we have strings. Okay, we have a bunch of things here. I'm going to finish up the date real quick here. So after the priority here, I'm going to display, and I'm going to use \n to say go to the next line, okay? And then \t to just space out to the right. And I'm going to say started on, followed by date started. And guess what? Date started is a reference attribute. It contains a reference to an object of class date. So let's see what it displays on the screen, okay? Because internally, the date in Java is stored as a number of milliseconds elapsed since January 1st, 1970. And it has to do with, if I remember correctly, it has to do with, was that the release of a Unix system or something like that, one of the generation of Unix system? But bottom line is, this is a number of milliseconds. But if I run this code here, look at this. This is a nicely formatted, humanly readable date that I get. So that means that the date class must implement the toString method. It has to do it so that it appears nicely like this. Yeah. Yeah, to the code, to do item. There we go. So at the end, I added, pretty much here's the date. Yeah. Which one started on null? Date created?
Yeah,
for T2. Huh, interesting. So hold on.
Mine did that as well because I didn't use this operator in T2. I just left it as I initialized all the variables instead of using this comment.
So make sure that you have both of the first two. So both of the first two constructors, you forward, right, with the def keyword like we have here and here. That was it for you? Okay. So because that would mean that when you create like T2, right, you're using this particular constructor. So if it doesn't forward to the third, then the date never gets created, and by default it's going to be null. Okay. Is that also what happened with you?
I saw that it did that on mine as well, and I remember I didn't put it.
All right, cool. All right. So, okay, this is a good illustration of, like when I told you at the beginning of the class, I told you COP2513 is not necessarily harder than 2512. It's different, okay? So 2512 and IE0, okay, some of you had a hard time with IE0, and you told me, like, writing from scratch, etc., is a problem, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so we can work on that, okay? But the kind of difficulty that you are going to encounter now and until the end of the semester is going to be more like this one, okay? I have 3 constructors. Look at those constructors. Aren't they awesome? One line for 2 of them. That's not big code. That's not complicated code, right? And the last one has, 4 lines that do 4 assignments to variable. We don't have loops. We don't have nested loops. We don't have anything like that fancy, really. But what can go wrong? There's still things that can go wrong. What we are working on together this semester to understand is even when we write very simple code using object-oriented techniques, okay, what is Java doing in the background? What does that mean, those 3 constructors? When are they being called? When are they calling one another? What can go wrong when they call one another? Like, for example, that infinite, delegation stuff where nobody ever finishes initializing that object. See what I'm saying? It's a different kind of complexity, a different kind of difficulty. So here we have our date. The last thing I'm going to add is a Boolean is completed or is done, just for the sake of having different data type, okay? So private Boolean is done. And same thing, I have only one constructor to update. So when you create a to-do item, I'm going to assume you create it because you have to do it. So it's not done yet, okay? So I'm going to say des.isDone equal false. That's the default, okay? And actually, I could have even skipped that line because by default, the attribute, when it's a Boolean, okay, Java is going to actually put the false inside of it by default. Good catch. So, all right. So is done, not id done. Is done is false. Let's compile this. And let's put it in the toString. And I'm just going to add stuff, I'm going to add stuff on its own line so that it's a little bit more readable here. So I'm going to do this like this here. There we go. And then plus. Here comes the priority. And then I'm going to, at the end, actually, you know what? No, at the beginning, I'm going to display one of two things. I'm going to display either des, like an empty square bracket if it's not completed, and if it's completed, I want to put a x in the middle. Okay? So again, you don't have to use ternary conditional operators, but I'm going to so that you get progressively used to them. So I have two possibilities here. Let me put the space here. All right, I want either this or this. Okay, these are the two possible values that I want. And my condition, I'm going to write it like this, in parentheses and with a question mark after. My condition is if is done, so is done or is done equal true, that's the same thing. Okay. When you say if a Boolean, that means if that Boolean is true. So if is done equal true, then I want to display that guy, actually. Else, I want to display that guy. So this is an expression that's going to be evaluated into one of two possible values, depending on whether the condition is true or false. And then I stick that values, I concatenate it with a space after it, and then I put the title, and then I put the description, everything that we have been doing until now. Okay? And no, I don't have to write everything on one line like that and try to be fancy there. It's just that you might as well be exposed to that syntax as well. Let me scroll up, show the test, make sure that it's working, and then, yeah, if you have a question, go for it. All right. What's up? Absolutely. To the top? I added it at the end. The last modification was at the end for toString. Is that what you wanted to see? Oh, okay. Private Boolean is done. Yeah, okay.
We don't initialize that,
No, don't initialize it. And inside the constructor, actually, inside the constructor, I do initialize it, but it's kind of like, it's not necessary, right? I took the third constructor. Let me show you. Hold on. Let me close this here. There we go. I took the third constructor, the one that does the actual work. And at the end of it, I said, well, des.isDone equal false. Okay? But I could have done without that because by default, the attribute of type Boolean is initialized to false. Yes, question?
That's what I was going to ask.
Okay.
For the just false if you didn't initialize.
Yeah. So isDone being false, anything being null, any reference assigned to null, any numerical type assigned to 0, yes, I could skip it. Okay. And other thing that I could skip it, I could skip it speaking proper English too. I could remove those des here, okay? Just to make sure we're all on the same page. These are not important. All right, and now we have one thing left to do, which is, you know what? I need to test that isDone, is doing its job. So, for example, a T4 here, new to-do item, and then I'm running out of IDs here, so I'm just going to put ... or not. There we go. Priority 99, and then I'm going to display T4, but before this I'm going to do T4 dot set done. So I need a method called set done that is going to allow me, real easy, public void set done is going to allow me to set the flag, the attribute here, to to pretty much true. Okay, so is done equal true. And then I could add a date completed here. So I could say date completed equal new date, and add my attribute date completed here. So use the same thing that I did for date started. There we go, date completed, and then add it here, started on. I'm going to add also completed on, and that's it, date completed. All right. Yes, question.
You don't have to add date completed to the constructor?
I don't have to add it to the constructor as a parameter. I'm just keeping it as an attribute. Okay. It's going to be null until what? Until I want to change a value, and I want to change a value when you tell me that the task is completed. In which case, boom, I initialize it for the first time to the current date object. So yeah, this example is simple, but it illustrates, different things we attribute, like the ones that you initialize with a parameter, the one that you wait, to initialize until they are used, and so on and so forth. All right. So before they kick us out, we're going to stop for today. But you know the drill. So I'm not continuing the office hour here, obviously, for obvious reason. But tomorrow I will have office hours. If you cannot make them, but you need to meet me, drop me a Canvas message, okay? So I can try to meet you before IE1 is due. All right? All right. Well, thank you, and good luck, everyone, for IE1.